Hey there, and welcome back to the podcast. Today, I'm going to be sharing with you my personal 4 season garden plan. This subject was actually prompted by a couple of comments. The first one I received from John on YouTube with a simple request. He said, "Here is a video topic I'm interested in. What is your planting schedule and overall plan?" And then about that same time, Nicole, a member of my Dream to garden planning online course, asked me a question during our regular office hours along the same lines. She said, "As you build out your new kitchen garden and focus on fresh eating, I'm curious how you are balancing out and planting a variety of items and planting enough of each item to get the quantity that you want. I'm sure that you're focusing on interplanting and relay planting, but I would love to know more on how things are coming together so that I can plan my own garden space." As I considered this feedback and these requests, it occurred to me that while I do spend a lot of time on the podcast and in my online courses, especially in the early part of the year, helping you plan out your garden, perhaps it would be helpful for you if you were able to see an example of these concepts in my own garden. Now, I hope to be able to show you this on YouTube this year as my plan starts to take shape. But since you right now may still be early in your garden planting journey, I wanted to go ahead and give you my plan. As with any plans, this is subject to adjustment, but hopefully by seeing my rhythm, you can get an idea of what's possible for you as you plan your own garden space. As I share with you my 2024 4 season garden plan, I want you to keep a few things in mind, especially if you are a first time or newish gardener. First, I've developed these rhythms over time. This is my 11th season, and I have learned a lot over the years by observation, which, quite frankly, can only be learned by doing. So, if you are in your first or second season, don't compare your beginning of your garden journey to my 11th season. Know that you'll have a learning curve and you don't have to do all that I'm doing to have a successful garden. So keep that in mind. Don't get overwhelmed. If you're a brand new gardener, this may seem like, wow, how can I ever do this? You can do it. It may take some time. Hopefully, it won't take you as much time as it took me, but take little bits and pieces of what I'm sharing with you if you're a new gardener and see how you can incorporate it into your garden this year. You don't have to do it all. But second, if you don't want to wait 11 years to put a few of these rhythms into practice, everything I'm going to be talking to you about today, I teach how to do in my online garden planning course, Dream to Garden. And we're actually opening it back up for new students for a limited time starting next week. Depending on when you're watching this, I believe it's opening up the middle part of April. I can't remember the exact date. But to put your name on the wait list so that you'll be notified when it opens up, you can go to journeywithjill.net/dream to garden. This course will walk you through determining how to make a 3 or even 4 season garden work for you based on your climate. And that brings us to point number 3. I will be sharing dates with you, but that's mostly to give you context. Unless you live in a zone 8A with an average last frost date of April 8th, an average first frost date of November 1st, and 85-degree heat tends to arrive in early June and doesn't relent until September, then your plan will be different than mine. Maybe slightly, maybe considerably, depending on your climate. Now, if your garden does check all those boxes, you're in a zone 8A, your average last frost date is April 8th, your first is November 1st, and your heat sets in from early June to September, then by all means, steal my plan. It should work for you. But for everyone else, pay attention to the rhythms. Pay attention to how you see that my garden actually goes on a season to season basis, and then use your own climate patterns to adjust the date. The main thing I'm going to share with you today is my planting schedule. And to share this with you, I am literally opening up my complete garden planner. If you're on YouTube, you can see this. I'm sorry if it's backwards. It may be backwards. Anyway, I'm literally opening up my planner and I am going to my monthly calendar where I have all of my planting dates listed for the entire year. This is something that I do in January when I plan my year's garden. And it's something that I teach you how to do in Dream to Garden. And you've probably heard me say this before, but the reason I do this is because if I can plan my entire year of planting in advance, then during the growing season, when things are starting to get planted, like now in many cases, all I have to do is look each week to see what my calendar tells me to do and when. And obviously, I do have to keep in mind that I need to adapt to the weather. So if my calendar tells me it's time to plant tomatoes and the temperatures haven't, risen adequately at night, then I'll put them on hold. So understand that even with the plan, you still have to look at weather conditions when you're actually going to execute that plan. But without a plan to begin with, then you're just left to chance. Like, when should I plant? And is this going to work? So, all that to say, this is where I'm getting my planning schedule for you so that you can see the rhythms. Now, a lot goes on in my garden from January to about April or May, and then it'll kind of slow down as far as the executing the plan part. So, I'll be spending a lot more time on these spring months as I'm sharing with you what I'm doing and why. And then it'll go a little bit quicker as we get toward the fall. So, let's talk about January. For context, this is about 3 months before my average last frost date in the spring. In the middle of January, I started to sow lettuce, broccoli, cabbage, and celery, and also parsley indoors. Now, this is really early for lettuce, partly because lettuce is a little bit more freeze tender and it doesn't take as long to grow inside. But the reason I started lettuce this early was because I knew that I could put it in my greenhouse. I knew that I could cover it if need be early in the season. For a beginner, you probably are not going to want to start lettuce this soon, but it was the first planting of lettuce. So I only actually planted, my goal was three, I think, three plants of lettuce. I think I ended up getting six because I always double plant. But that was just the first planting. You'll see a theme here. And this is one thing I want you to pay attention to as you're listening to my plan is I want you to pay attention to succession planting. This is how, to answer Nicole's question at the beginning here, how I'm planning on having plenty of fresh food throughout the season. Some crops I am just planting once, but some I'm continually planting over the course of the season. So definitely keep your ear open to that so that you can get an idea of how this actually works in a full season garden. Again, mid January, indoor sowing all of those crops. Also, that's about the time that I wanted to order my seed potatoes. That's because I usually plan on planting them out in early part of March. And I found that with seed potatoes, especially if I'm ordering them, so this year Wood Prairie Farms sent me theirs. Theirs come where they're not entirely sprouted. A lot of times they're still in the dormant state or they're just starting to sprout. And I found it helpful to have them a little bit earlier if possible so that I can get them sprouted and get them out of dormancy before I plant them. Now, if you buy from your local feed store, a lot of times those seed potatoes have already sprouted and they've sprouted a lot, sometimes too much, just depending on when you get them. But that's why when I order from Wood Prairie, I like to order a little bit early. Now, if you are late on your order, it's not that you can't plant potatoes by any means. I just like to get them ready to go before I plant them in the garden. Those are the tasks in mid January. That's usually about the second week of January. The third week of January, this year, I'm trying something new, and hopefully you'll see this a little bit. I am following the main rhythm that I've followed for many years, but I'm still trying new things. And this time I'm starting to indoor sow onions later than normal with the purpose of planting them out later, with the purpose of harvesting them later to get a harvest of onions that can actually store longer into the next year. I am just about here. I'm recording this in March. I'm just about to run out of onions in my pantry that I've been able to store since the last year's harvest. But the reason that I still have them, this is the first time ever, is because I planted some onions late last year on accident and it ended up working really well. So I actually had indoor sown my first onions in December, early December. Those I already planted out, which I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll tell you about that. But I'm wanting to tell you about the second sowing is something that I'm trying again this year to see if it works as well. I started that the third week of January. Another thing that I started the third week of January is I started direct sowing my greens. my spinach, my arugula, my brassica greens that you hear me talk about. I started direct sowing them the third week of January. And like lettuce, this was the first succession with those. Now, I will say that we had a pretty cold snap, I think late in January. I can't remember, maybe early February, where we got down to about 20. And the ones that I didn't cover, even though they had sprouted, they ended up dying. So next time I'll either start a little bit later or I'll make sure to cover those. But I will say that those I had to eventually replant, lesson learned. The fourth week of January, I indoor sowed another batch of lettuce. Again, very few, I think 3 to 6 is how many I ended up having. I also sowed 3 tomato plants that I planned to grow in the greenhouse early. This is not the time, late January is not the time to start tomatoes. It's way too early if you're planning on planting them in the garden. But because I planned on trying to get them in the greenhouse and heat the greenhouse when needed, that was my goal to be able to get tomatoes earlier. So I started a few of them early to be able to get early tomatoes. Again, you're kind of seeing a pattern, hopefully, of how I'm taking advantage of flexing the seasons a little bit based on what I have available and some observations that I've made in the past. That was January. So as you can see, the focus really was on getting started with cool season crops. And then we move into February. February was 2 months before my average last frost date. And February is when a lot of stuff starts to happen as far as planting in my climate. The first week, I direct sowed more greens, the brassica greens. And when I talk about the greens, these are greens mixes that I got from Johnny's. There's the premium greens mix, the ovation greens mix, and the cheap frills mix. I think those are the three mixes that I'm planting this year, but they're all brassica greens, so they're more hardy than your mesclun greens or your lettuce greens. So that's what I started the first week of February. Again, directly sowing them. That was going in my green stock. All of these greens have gone in my green stock so far. But that was the second round of direct sowing those greens. The second week of February, I started indoor sowing a third round of lettuce. Hopefully, you're getting the idea here that I'm trying to have lettuce and I'm trying to have greens to have various stages of maturity so that they don't all harvest at once, but so that I can get an early harvest. And then once I harvest that, I have some more coming on. So it's a continuous planting. So that second week, I indoor sowed my third round of lettuce indoors. I also planted beets indoors. I'm still trying to get good at that. That's been something that I've always done beets outside, but I'm trying to maybe get a jump start on beets by starting some indoors. And then I also started some cooler season flowers. I'm not going to be focusing a lot on flowers on this podcast episode, just because a lot of what I'm doing with flowers very much mirrors how I'm doing my vegetables. And a lot of those flowers are more for pollinators and things like that. I know many of you guys are interested in flowers, and we're going to be talking more about that in the future. But for today's episode, we're really going to focus on the vegetables and some of the herbs. The second week in February, besides indoor sowing the lettuce, number 3 is what I call it, my third round of lettuce, my goal was also to transplant my first sowing of lettuce. Now, this obviously is weather dependent. If it's going to be in the 20s, I'm not going to do it yet. I definitely wait until the temperatures are a little bit better. Now, this year actually was in luck because we had probably the warmest February on record. So I was able to get out my lettuce and they're doing fantastic. But I transplanted those the second week. And then I also, and this was again mainly because the temperatures were doing well, I could tell that the soil temperature was warming up. I transplanted my first round of onions. These were the ones that I started in December. Sometimes I don't do that until early March. This is the time of year that I really just have to watch the weather to see what is fruited. But this year, getting those onions in the ground a little bit earlier ended up working well. They're doing fantastic. The third week of February, we've got another round of greens and arugula. Again, this is in my green stock, but again, you can see that I'm just continuing to plant. And then the fourth week of February, I sowed my peppers, eggplants, and tomato seeds indoors. I used to do this earlier in February, but every year, the last couple of years, especially since I started using my greenhouse, I realized that my plants were overgrowing their containers before the garden was ready for them. Now, it figures this year. It seems like we're getting an early spring. We'll see. Time will tell if that happens. But I decided to delay them to the fourth week of February. I think March 1st is when I actually planted them. So they are a little bit later than they ever have been. But my goal is to make it where they're not so stressed when they are not quite ready to go out into the garden. Also, that fourth week of February, I transplanted my second round of lettuce, and I also sowed some beet seeds. So I actually ended up transplanting my beets into the garden pretty quickly, right when they got their little seed leaves. I didn't even wait for them to have true leaves. I sowed them in the Epic 16 cell trays, which those little, they're tiny, so they couldn't stay in that tray very long. I went ahead then and I transplanted those beets out into the garden. And then at the same time, I just sowed another round of beet seeds. So it'll be kind of interesting to compare the two to see how they compare in their growth, one being transplanted and one being direct sowed. So that's was February. Now, March is when things really start getting going. As far as planting, I would say March is probably my busiest month. Again, just for reference, this is 1 month before my average last frost date. The first week in March, this was my goal. I ended up planting some of these earlier again because I was reading the signs that the temperatures were warming up. And again, I'm talking about cool season crops. I am not planting anything that can't handle a frost or a freeze at this point. But my goal the first week of March, which, like I said, ended up happening most of these late in February, I direct sowed my carrot seeds. And as I mentioned, beet seeds. And I think the pea seeds I actually did sow the first week of March. To me, the first week of March is has always been perfect for sowing pea seeds. And then also I had on my calendar to start basil seeds indoors, but I completely missed that somehow. So those are getting a little bit of a late start, but that's okay. If you listen to the podcast episode, I think last week, basil's easy to grow. So I'm not too worried about that. But ideally, I would have started basil indoors about a month before my average last frost date. And then the first week in March is usually my goal of when I'm going to plant potatoes. Now, this also is very weather dependent because I don't want to plant potatoes when the soil temperature is below 50 degrees, because a lot of times, especially if you have cold soil coupled with a lot of rain, those seed potatoes could rot in the ground. And also, the cooler the temperature is, the longer it's going to take for those potatoes to germinate. So I don't ever want to start too early. But this year, again, we're getting so warm that I actually ended up planting my potatoes in late February. One reason is because the best potato year that I've ever had was about 8 years ago, I guess. I was a fairly new gardener, and that's why I thought, oh, potatoes were easy. But looking back at it, I'm realizing that that particular spring came early. We didn't have a ton of rain in the spring, which has been the case this year, probably the first year since 8 years ago that I've actually experienced that. And so the soil itself was not too waterlogged, and I was able to plant a little bit earlier. And I had the best harvest I've ever had. And I think that's because I was able to plant earlier. The soil temperature was warmed, the soil was not soggy. The plants were able to grow in the cool season. Potatoes are really cool season crops, even though they can't take a freeze on their foliage because they don't like the heat. So the sooner I can get them in within reason, I think the better of a chance I have for harvest. So we'll see. But I did get them sown a little bit earlier than planted just because of the way that the season works. The second week of March, I planted cucumber seeds in a greenhouse grow bag. I'm doing the same thing with cucumbers as I'm doing with tomatoes. I'm just doing one or two plants indoors in the greenhouse in a grow bag so that I can get an early harvest. I'm so ready for cucumbers on my salad. Having salad every day and I'm ready for cucumbers. I want to get them going. So I started those in the greenhouse, knowing that I'll take them outside the greenhouse whenever after the danger of frost has passed. And then also this is about the time that I would direct sow dill. I also ended up getting a couple of dill transplants from Lowe's, I think, and not necessary, but needed to fill some pockets in my green stock and I didn't want to wait. But typically this would be when I would sow dill. The third week of March is when I like to start my squash, watermelon, and cantaloupe seeds indoors. And if you've heard my past podcast episodes, indoor sowing squash and zucchini is not necessarily something I recommend for beginners, but there's a reason that I do it. And that's when I do it. I do it about 3 weeks before I plan on planting them out in the garden. Same thing with watermelon and cantaloupe. And this is also the week that I take my sweet potatoes from my pantry that I've harvested from last year, and I start developing slips on those so that I can have those slips ready to go in the garden in May. So that starts actually, what I say, the third week of March, with the goal of planting them out usually the beginning of May. Another thing that I'm doing that third week is transplanting celery if the weather shows that it's ready for it. Celery is another cool season crop. It hates the heat, but it doesn't really like the freezes. And so, as long as I can see that there's not any freezing temperatures in the forecast, then I'll transplant celery. And then this year, since I decided that I am doing a couple of straw bales for straw bale gardening in one of my raised beds. We've got a YouTube raised bed, my new kitchen garden series that I'm showing you about that on YouTube if you're interested in that. But I'm starting my straw bale conditioning during this period because squash is going to go there. And I know that I will probably want to plant squash in about 3 weeks. That gives us 3 weeks to be able to condition those bales. That's what I'm doing in the third week. And that's definitely on my garden calendar. The fourth week of March is catch up projects, anything that needs to be done, in the garden, around the garden. I don't really have anything planned to plant that week. But March is also the time that we really start harvesting heavy. Of course, if you've heard my podcast episode on a winter garden, I've been harvesting all winter long with greens. So those actually haven't stopped. Spinach started in February. And so harvest has actually been going on. But as far as the crops that I started planting in January and February, greens, lettuce, spinach, I'm harvesting all of that in March. So as we go for the rest of the months on this calendar, which will go a little bit quicker than what I've been able to do so far, I'm going to share with you what I'm harvesting because it's important to know that most months of the year, you're actually in a plan like this, you're actually sowing and harvesting. You're doing both. Some months like March is going to be more heavy on the sowing. Some months like September, October are going to be more heavy on the harvest, but in every month, most months, you'll have a little bit of both. So moving on to April, this is our last frost date month, our average last frost date month. And the first couple of weeks, I don't really plan anything, even though our average last frost date is about April 8th. I don't usually plan anything then because it's really the time of year that I need to be watching the weather. If if temperatures are consistently at night in the 50s or above, then I'll plant my tomatoes. But I don't really necessarily plan for that until about the third week in April, just because, man, I've just been hit by too many late frosts and it's not fun. This year wouldn't be so bad because I'm not planting that many tomatoes. I think I've got 4 that I'm planning to plant outside. But in the past, when I've had 30 to 50, that has been a chore. So I'm like, I don't do that again. So I'm planning on planting tomatoes that third week of April, and also squash the third week of April. The fourth week of April, I'm planning on planting my second succession of onions, and then also watermelon, cantaloupe, and basil. Now, again, if we continue to warm up quicker and sooner, I'll plant those earlier. But my plan is to get those planted out the fourth week, just because, especially those melons, they really like it a little bit warmer. In April, I'm continuing to harvest greens and lettuce. That's a continue, like lots of greens, lots of salads. I mean, I have them every day anyway, but there's a lot fresh, new, delicious. So good all the way in April. And if I were to plant radishes, I'd probably be harvesting radishes too, but I don't think this year I've planted any so far. All right, let's move on to May. May is the month after the last frost date has passed. And this is when it really starts warming up in my climate. And so this is when I'm going to transplant peppers and eggplant. I'm going to wait a little bit, usually a couple weeks after the last frost has passed. Just let that soil warm up, let the temperatures rise. And then also direct sowing my first round of cucumbers directly in the garden, directly sowing okra seeds, and planting sweet potatoes. So all the warm season lovers are going to be going in the garden the month after my average last frost date has passed, but usually it's just a couple of weeks after that happens. And then in May is when more of the harvest starts coming on. We still have greens, still have lettuce, but now the peas are starting to come, the snap peas. Broccoli is starting to harvest. Squash and even sometimes cabbage will come on in May. So we're starting to get some of those early crops being able to harvest in May. June is a little bit of a slower month. We do have harvest going on, which I'll share with you. But as far as planting, I'm going to be the second week of June. My plan is to direct sow my second planting of cucumbers. as I mentioned, I think it was last week, I want to continue having cucumbers planted and harvesting so that I can continue having fresh cucumbers all season long. The third week of June, I have a note to order seed potatoes from the fall. I planted fall potatoes last year. They didn't do as great as I expected them to do, but I'm determined because to me, having those potatoes going into winter is so important. But my local beef store for sure does not carry them this time of year. The only place that I've been able to find seed potatoes for a fall planting has been Wood Prairie. And last year they accepted orders through July, but the year before that they ran out of stock. And so they cut off orders at the end of June. So I'm planning on making sure and putting that order in third week of June. That way I can have the potatoes ready to plant for a fall crop, which will be in late July. Now, as far as harvesting in June, I'm harvesting a whole lot. Some of it is during the middle of June, some is toward the end of June into July. But some of the things that will start harvesting in June are going to be cabbage, carrots, squash, beets, garlic, potatoes, tomatoes, celery, cucumbers. You can see June in my areas when the harvest is really starting to come on. Like I said, a lot of that's more late June, just depending on the season, but still June's when a lot of that harvest is starting to come. Next, we have July, which I always thought was more of a slow week when it comes to planting until I learned how important number one, succession planting can be. And number two, that's when a lot of fall crops get started. Now, I know it's hard. It's hard for new gardeners to recognize that fall crops need to be started in the middle of July. But before we get there, the first thing I'm going to do in July, this is actually the second week of July, I'm going to direct sow my corn and the second round of squash. I like to sow corn in the second week of July, usually right after July 4th weekend, because I found that the garden space is not so much as at a premium during that time of year because as you remember, so much is already harvested at the end of June. And also I find that I have more time to actually harvest and put it up if I'm freezing or something like that toward the end of the season. And corn, even though it needs a lot of water, that's really not hard to accomplish with irrigation, but it doesn't mind the heat. And so that's one of the crops along with okra and sweet potatoes that will grow in our heat without any problems. That's another reason why I wait until July to sow corn. I could sow it as early as after my average last frost date, and I did that for years. One thing that I one thing that I noticed when I did that though is we tend to get spring storms, and I've had so many times of corn planting just be pummeled by the wind, and then it really hurts the harvest. By planting in the middle of July, we are pretty much out of that really hard storm season. Now, if you live in the Gulf and you get hurricanes, that may be a little, you may want to do it opposite from me. But for us, our storms are tornadoes and high winds. So by planting in the middle of July, it's a way for me to escape that for the most part. And then, as I mentioned, directly sowing squash. This is my second round of squash because I know that my first round has already been killed by squash vine borers. Can set a clock to that. So I'm planting a second round. The third week in July, I'm planning on direct sowing a third round of cucumbers. Still the same theme, succession planting. And then I plan on starting my beets indoors. And I just realized the second week of July, I skipped something. Let me go back. The second week of July is when I indoors start my broccoli, cabbage, celery, and my first planting of lettuce. So second week, starting all over with cool season crops. Third week, I'm going to try to start beets again. That will be dependent on how the spring worked with starting it indoors. We'll see. And then the fourth week, I'm actually going to try a second sowing of broccoli to see if I can spread out my broccoli harvest a little bit longer into the winter. So I'm going to do that the fourth week of July. And then also that fourth week of July, I'm going to sow my potatoes, my seed potatoes for a fall harvest. And then this is when I'm starting again with specific plantings of greens every other week. Now, throughout the summer, I didn't write this down, but I do it by rote. Anytime I harvest a pocket of greens from my green stalk, I immediately re-sow arugula because arugula will last all summer long. You just have to cut it quicker. And so that's what I'm doing all summer long. But then at the end of July, I'm making an effort not only to sow arugula, but also start again with those brassica greens and direct sowing those so I can have more than just arugula in my salads. As far as harvesting goes in July, tomatoes, peppers, okra, cucumbers, everything as far as the summer crop, those are coming on. And then we move to August, which is at this point, now we're starting to plan ahead against the average first frost date, which is the beginning of November. So August is 3 months until my average first frost date. I am directly sowing a final round of squash because I have time. I have 3 months. So that give me plenty of time for that final round. And then carrots, beets, more greens. And then in August, I'm going to start indoor sowing lettuce again. And then at the end of August, I'll be transplanting broccoli, cabbage, and beets. And again, when it comes to the harvest, I'm harvesting tomatoes, okra, and peppers. September is following about the same pattern that August did. We are 2 months until our average first frost date. I'm continuing to direct sow every other week greens. I'm starting lettuce indoors. Again, this is something I'm doing about every other week and I'm staggering it. So 1 week I'm direct sowing grains. The week after that, I'm starting lettuce indoors and I'm doing this every other week, just like I did in the spring. And then I will also start toward the end of September, I will direct sow spinach. And I wait until the end of September to direct sow spinach because the soil temperature needs to get low enough for those spinach seeds to sprout. That is for an early spring harvest for next year. They'll sprout, they won't grow much, they'll overwinter in my zone, and they'll start growing again in January and February, and that's when I'll get my spinach harvest. In September, I'll also transplant my second round of broccoli and then I'll transplant celery because celery doesn't love the heat. So I like to wait till September to do that. And then I'm harvesting greens again, lettuce again, squash, cucumbers. Hopefully, I still have tomatoes, just depending on the disease and the heat and all of that. Some years I have them, some years I don't. And then we come to October, which is 1 month before our average first frost date. I'm still sowing greens every other week. Then I also sow garlic at the end of October. And then I'm harvesting greens, lettuce, squash, cucumbers, tomatoes, if I still have them, okra, and sweet potatoes. Now, okra is usually starting to wind down in October just because once it starts getting cooler, okra doesn't produce as much. And by that point, I've had so much okra that sometimes I don't keep it cut, which probably is also part of the problem. But usually okra is starting to wind down. But then I'm harvesting my sweet potatoes typically in October. November, I'm not really planting anything except I think I do plant one last direct sowing of greens. And then at that point, it's just harvest. November is all harvest greens, lettuce, broccoli, carrot, beets, fall potatoes. I'm starting to harvest those in November. And then December, I'm still harvesting greens, lettuce, broccoli, cabbage, carrots, and beets. And some of those days in November and December, because our frost has come, our freezes have come, I will have to cover. But as I learned in last year's season, I was able to cover and continue to get many of those overwintered and still be harvesting in January and February. That is how I've been able to achieve that 4 season garden. And I went through these, I feel like I went through them fast, but man, it's been over 30 minutes talking about this plan. And it's a lot. But these are the crops that we grow. And my goal for all of this is to be able to have as much fresh eating as I can, especially this year. My goal is fresh eating, not as much canning. There are some crops you notice that I didn't mention at all, like beans. That's because at this point, I'm not sure if I'm going to be growing beans for canning or not. But if I do, then I know that I can sow beans anytime after my average last frost date in April. I can also sow them up to July, just to get, especially bush beans, because they only take a couple of months to harvest. So I could insert beans at any point during this time. In past years, I have definitely made a point to succession sow beans so that I could get lots of beans, especially if I was growing bush beans. But that's why you didn't hear of those this year because I've simplified a lot this year just in the favor of fresh food eating. So I hope that this was helpful for you just to see the rhythm. Like I said, I mean, if you live in the same climate as me, you can go back to this episode and take notes when I say I do everything. But for most of you, that is not going to be precisely the case. And so that's why I created Dream to Garden so that I could show you how to do this for your own climate so that you know exactly when you are going to plant everything. For many of you, if you notice, so many of these cool season crops I've started in January, I started in February. And for many of you, it's too late. It's too late to sow these, especially if you get really hot in the summer like we do. And so one thing Dream to Garden can teach you is what you need to focus on. You'll be able to calculate when to plant. And if you see when you're supposed to plant and you see, oh man, I was supposed to plant a month ago, then you can be like, okay, I'm going to put that aside and I'll plant it in the fall instead because I teach you how to do a fall garden as well. That way, you're not wasting your garden space with something that is not going to grow well because the season isn't ideal for it. So, if you're interested in taking the next step in doing a 3 or 4 season garden plan, depending on your climate, what this will allow, we are opening Dream to Garden next week for a very limited time. Again, get on the wait list. I'll let you know more about that. It's at journeywithjill.net/dream to garden. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode. And if you found this episode helpful, I will be posting a story about it today. And just let me know. To me, I've never even thought about sharing my entire garden plan, and I hope it didn't bore you silly. But if you appreciated this, please let me know if you want more information on. If you would love to hear more about my rhythms in the garden, I'd love to hear from you. But if you just like the how to's, let me know that too. I always want to create episodes that are the most helpful for you and help you get to where you want to go in your garden. And if you're not yet, make sure and subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss an episode that drops on Tuesday. And next week's episode, we have a special guest that you will not want to miss. I will chat with you again next week.